Hi, I'm here today with Chad Pearson, who is an assistant professor of history at the University of North Texas. He studies ruling class organizations and violence in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And we are here to talk about his book, Capitals, Terrorists, Klansmen, Lawmen, and Employers in the Long 19th Century. The book was published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2022. Welcome, Professor Pearson. Could you tell us a little bit about the book's central arguments?
Certainly. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored to be here. And I want readers to understand at least a couple of things. Number one, that the United States became the dominant economic powerhouse after the Civil War. We all know that. The United States was also had the most violent labor relations. And I argue that the two are connected. And there are many reasons why the US became the dominant economic powerhouse: patents, education system, investment in education, that sort of thing. But it was also the role of repression. And so I maintain that there's a link between these two things. That is, that there's under capitalist society, there's often resistance in the form of strikes and protests. And then there's the response to that, various forms of repression. And so I look at the folks who really called the shots and participated in this repression, which I unapologetically refer to as the ruling class. And I look at their violent efforts to maintain production and stability, and I refer to it as terrorism. I seek to rescue the word terrorism from the Islamophobes. When we hear of terrorism, particularly in the wake of 9/11, it's often about Muslims and Arabs. And I looked at what their victims said, workers, former enslaved people, ordinary people, and they used words like terrorism. And sometimes these folks themselves use that word. So I want to understand that this terrorism or repression was a feature rather than a bug in US history. And so fundamentally, what I look at is the relationship between management and vigilantism from roughly the period just after the Civil War all the way up through the First World War. And I talk about what I call hard, soft, and hybrid forms of terrorism. So a hard form would be whippings, beatings, shootings, hangings. A soft form might be book burning or blacklists, blacklisting workers from workplaces. And then I call a hybrid version, which might be what I call a drive-out campaign. These were events where vigilantes would approach people and they'd say, you better get out of town by the time the sun comes up. And if they left voluntarily, I put that in scare quotes, that would be a soft form. But if they didn't, there might be some kidnapping and physical violence. So I look at a number of organizations, including the Ku Klux Klan, the First Klan, Law and Order Leagues, citizens associations, and stock growers associations, and I find sort of common themes here with respect to violence, what I refer to as terrorism.
Your scope is the scope of this study is large. Chronologically, you're spanning over half a century, and you've got sources from Idaho to Florida to Pennsylvania, and beyond. So, what was your process for deciding what to include?
Yes, so I wanted to understand different forms of repression or terrorism. And I have a series of case studies in this book. And those case studies allow me to better understand these forms of repression. So, for example, I look at northern Idaho and the Coeur d'Alene areas. And here you had a number, two very big labor confrontations, one in 1892 and another in 1899. And in both cases, the respective governors, declared martial law and arrested all the union members and their supporters and put them in what are called bullpens. These are basically concentration camps. And I said, this is interesting. You have the employers, the mine owners, as well as the state, both the state government and the federal government, supporting this sort of repressive activity. And so I thought it was a good way to really understand incarceration and what that meant in this context. Now, there's a pretty big scholarship about concentration camps, and scholars tend to say it was the Spaniards in Cuba who introduced this form of punishment. but I see it in 1892. 1892, of course, was before 1897. And so I think it's sort of something underexplored. I look at Tampa, Florida as well, where there's this extraordinary case of a kidnapping of 13 cigar workers from who are striking. And the Citizens Alliance, the elites, kidnap them, put them on a boat, send them to Honduras, and leave them there, right? Pretty astonishing stuff. And then come back. And other employers learn about this, and they're like, wow, kidnapping, that's a pretty good technique to solve our labor problem. And so this was sort of an early, rather remarkable event of sort of, labor suppression. And I thought the Tampa case helped tease out what that meant in practice. I look at Colorado and Pennsylvania. These were the scenes of massive mine confrontations. Northern Pennsylvania, going all the way back to the 1860s, 1870s, you have the Molly Maguires, where you hang people. There's 1897 and Lattimore, the so-called Lattimore Massacre in Pennsylvania, where sheriff's deputies shoot and kill 19 protesters. These were immigrants. And so that case, chapter 5, I think it is, help us see the role of guns and gunning down workers and that form of repression. And so I really wanted to understand, whippings, shootings, drive out campaigns, what these look like in practice, and use these various case studies, different confrontations, generally strikes, to help, tease out these issues.
So I want to keep building on this. I think because we're a Civil War era journal, broadly defined. I am going to focus in a little bit in our limited time on the Civil War and Reconstruction. But you begin your case studies by situating the Klan and similar organizations into this labor framework and this understanding of violence. So can you explain a little bit more about your reasoning for including the Klan? And then similarly, how should Reconstruction era historians think about the Klan?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I think if you look at scholars, popular culture, civil rights organizations, overwhelmingly, when the topic of the Klan comes up, what they call it is a hate group. And no doubt there were very hateful people in the Klan. But I think we also must understand the interests of those who led the organization. So I argue that the Klan served as a white supremacist employers association. Now, a cross class group of people held membership in the Klan, but the folks who called the shots tended to be these downwardly mobile plantation owners, merchants, lawyers, newspaper editors, fairly elite people who saw their world crumble before them in the wake of the Civil War. So if we're to take Du Bois's argument that the Civil War and Reconstruction was at least in part sort of a general strike, right? That we need to understand the Civil War both as a military conflict and as a labor conflict. After all, what are they fighting for, right? We need to understand that the folks at the top of society in the South were really pissed off about the transformation. And so the Klan emerged in 1866 thereabouts and spread and was led by more elite people who were very interested in forcing the former enslaved folks back into the workplaces, back onto the plantations, back onto the farms, back into the kitchens. Shut up and work, right? During their waking hours, they had very little interest. They did not hate productive and agricultural laborers, right? They certainly didn't like disrespectful, insubordinate African American freed people. They didn't like the folks who joined the union leagues or went to schools. And they certainly didn't like, and I think we can make a case that they hated the school teachers, those who led Black schoolhouses, because what that meant is that you're taking away the laborers from their productive duty on the farms and the plantations and getting them to sort of think critically. So I argue that we need to understand the Klan, the first Klan, and as well as the second Klan. I'm writing about the second Klan at the moment as an employers association. Just because there are working class and poor people in it doesn't mean that it didn't serve the interests of those at the top of society. And I think that the techniques that they used were later replicated by other vigilante groups as well. And so it's long past time to bring back sort of a class analysis uh, to Reconstruction and Civil War era.
Thank you. That's a really thought-provoking starting point, I think, for this study, and really interesting connections you're drawing there. So I couldn't help but notice as I was reading the book as well that the Civil War and its legacies are popping up throughout these case studies. You have veterans who are among the elites and members of these organizations. You've got free labor ideology popping up in different places. So in what ways do you think the Civil War or its legacy frame or otherwise contribute to the actions of these elite vigilantes?
Sure. I think the Civil War is so important ideologically and practically. So you have soldiers on both sides who will later on participate in various anti-labor union movements. For the Confederate veterans, some of whom were in the Klan, will later participate in anti-union groups. I talk about a guy by the name of N.F. Thompson, born in a slave holding family in Tennessee, serves under Nathan Bedford Forrest in the Ku Klux in the Civil War, and then is a Klansman. Is later the Southern booster and talks about the legacy of the South and the importance of struggle and sacrifice. And then you have Northerners, Union folks, who draw on Lincoln and the free labor ideology. Right, the leader of the National Association of the Manufacturers, they referred to him in 1903 as the Abraham Lincoln of the 20th century. That here's a guy who's going to help help workers fight against unions, and they frame unions like slaveholders. That the unions are forcing workers to hold membership in these organizations. And so, free labor ideology finds expression particularly in northern regions where folks embrace what's called the open shop philosophy, the open shop movement, right? This idea that you don't need to hold union membership to work in a workplace. It's framing, right? It's style rather than substance. It's an ideology that fundamentally serves the interest of management, but sounds very good rhetorically, right? So what sounds better, right? Closed shop or open shop? Open shop, right? What sounds better, the slave to the union or the free laborer, right? So in the late 19th and early 20th century, you have these employers recycling the language of the early Republican Party from the 1850s and 1860s. So and perhaps the story I like most is that there's a group called the Citizens Industrial Association of America, which is a big umbrella group of all sorts of employers, but they don't call themselves employers, they call themselves citizens, right? And one of the heads of it is a guy by the name of C.W. Post, of the cereal dude, Post Cereal. And their slogan was for the protection of the common people, for the protection of the common people. This is a slogan that Post heard from Abraham Lincoln as a boy in Springfield, Illinois. His father was friends with Abraham Lincoln, and he heard Lincoln say that. So here's the head of a union-busting organization using a slogan that comes directly from the mouth, apparently, of Abraham Lincoln. So that's kind of powerful, I think, rhetorically, to say, "Hey, we're not busting you, folks. We're elevating you. We're protecting you from these union thugs, just like we protected the enslaved person from slavery."
That's really interesting. Another theme that you stress repeatedly across this study is this theme of continuity. And we've talked about how the book really runs from Reconstruction to World War One, but in fact, it actually goes even earlier. In some cases, you're referring back to the Seminole Wars. But could you tell us a little bit more about why you think continuity is so important when we're thinking about these relationships between capital and violence?
Yes, absolutely. I think that anytime there's going to be challenge to the ruling class, there's going to be a response. And so what this book does is it looks at the different forms of repressive techniques that are used throughout much of history. I guess I could have gone back even further. I could have brought it up even closer to the present. But where this comes across most clearly is in chapter 4 on the kidnapping in Tampa, where I very speculatively say, well, look, hey, this is the same place where we had the Second Seminole War, and how did they take care of the Seminoles? Well, they kidnapped them, they captured the leaders, and they deported them, just like they did in 1981. Excuse me, 1901, when they took the leaders of the cigar workers, and so I was like kind of thinking, and the leader who was involved in that campaign was also an amateur historian who read and wrote about the Second Seminole War. So it's very speculative. I don't have direct evidence per se, but I thought it would be an interesting thing to say, and people could take me on. That's fine. But we see it. We see whenever there's sort of kind of resistance, there's going to be a repressive response, and that was true in the 1780s, the 1830s, the 1880s, and all the way up to the 1980s to the present. Maybe we could talk about Occupy Wall Street or something. Where you had this confrontation, and the cops came in and smashed them. The pipeline conflicts. We see it in environmental struggles in the present day, and so I think repression is something that we really need to come to terms with, and make it more essential in how we understand the story of America and the story of the world more broadly.
I noticed, I was thinking as I was reading about other historians, particularly of the Civil War and Reconstruction, but that comment you made at the very beginning of this interview, like the violence is not a bug, it's a feature. And I feel like that's something that historians are emphasizing over and over is like there's continuity here, right?
Sure.
The violence is long running and a feature,
Right.
if you will,
Right.
not a bug. So we are closing out the interview now, but I wanted to ask you before we end, is there anything else you'd like to emphasize about this study, particularly as it relates to the war and Reconstruction?
Yeah, broadly, one of the things that got me interested in writing about, well, basically, I write about people I don't like. Right. I want to know more about the folks who make the lives of ordinary people miserable. And so that's sort of my starting point, oftentimes. And I think there's a tendency, and maybe I see it a lot with my students, to use the passive voice in their writing. So, for example, I'll say, conditions were bad, wages were low, and you want to know, like, well, who are the folks responsible for this, and why is there so much use of the passive voice, including among professional historians, right? When they talk about power relations, it's almost like an unwillingness to confront this. And I think in some ways it's hard, right? I mean, it's you're challenging power, and inevitably that's going to put you in hot water with some people. But I would just encourage people to listeners to ask the tough questions, to understand power relations, and to be unafraid to address these dimensions.
Thank you so much for joining us today. It was really wonderful to hear more about your book and some of your thinking that runs throughout the argument.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been a great honor.
All right.